All right, guys, welcome back to the Seiji Bard podcast, where we discuss business, finance, health, wealth, and social issues with a unique perspective. My name is Bard.
And I am Seiji.
And we just lost camera link. Sorry, guys. I'm going to keep talking while we while we get this going. It's going to be a struggle, but we'll try to make it through. Today, we're going to be talking about. Go ahead and break it down for us, Seiji.
Well, what we're talking about is actually a topic that we mentioned in our last podcast, which was about Barbary Coast pirates capturing finding white slaves. So what we were going to be talking about is a book that was written by a professor from the University of Ohio, Roger Davis. And the name of his book is Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, White Slavery in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Coast, and Italy between 1500 and 1800. And this is a fascinating topic because most people don't realize, at least in the United States, that there was a time when you actually had African slave masters with white slaves. And with African slave masters, ethnically they varied from being Arab Muslims to, mixed Arab Africans to even dark-skinned Africans who also had white slaves. And those sub-Saharan Africans were also involved in the slave trade all across North Africa as well.
Let me ask you this.
Yes.
Let's do this. Let's pull up. Let's kind of talk about this map real quick. Let me pull this up. We've got a map. I want to show the Barbary Coast. If you could maybe kind of walk people through this a little bit, if you don't mind. Just showing.
Sure. So where you have, right there you have Morocco going from left to right on this map. So from the western side going east back towards where you see Tripoli. So Morocco would be the same country today, Morocco. Algiers would be Algeria today. Tunis would be Tunisia. And Tripoli would be what we would call Libya, where Gaddafi was. So these are all places, not all, but a lot of places where you had the Arab Spring back about 10, 12 years ago.
Okay, so the Barbary Coast, this was their basically where they hunted.
Yes. So, that was where they were kind of headquartered all along the coast. And then they would raid across the Mediterranean into basically Southern Europe, raiding at will for nearly 300 years. They were some of the most fearsome raiders that the Europeans encountered, and they sailed as far as Iceland to capture slaves.
I read just recently in one of the documents that she sent me, or maybe something I looked up, that the British, that several people who were in Europe, several like along the coast, people moved away from the coast because they were afraid of these slavers. They were terrified. They moved further inland because this is, the coast is where you became a victim, and it became a thing. Where the slavers, the Barbary slavers, would easily capture people and enslave them. I even read something about an American guy talking about how these pirates took out 130 sailors, just took them out, made them slaves.
Oh yeah, this was called impressment, where ships would look for extra hands on deck, and they would just capture people at will. So when we're looking at this, going back to the first slide, so that all of you have a better idea for anyone watching this podcast, you can see where you have Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. And then you have the Ottoman Empire, which also covered Egypt and Southern Europe at the time. But this gives you an idea of the proximity between Morocco and the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain. Spain, Portugal. The difference between Spain and Morocco is only 11 miles. So only 11 miles of ocean separate Spain and Morocco, meaning you can see Africa from southern Spain.
Interesting. I've always said that proximity equals opportunity, especially in terms of enslavement. Usually when we talk about enslavement, we're usually talking about Western Europe, or the Europeans, really all of them. All of them, I'm finding out more and more of them were involved than I had originally known, including Central Europe, which is insane. Like the Germans found their way down in Namibia. And and just
here's the thing to think about, Bart. Like when we're looking at this time period from 1500 to 1800, this is only 8 years. So Ferdinand and Isabella were only able to unite Spain under Christian control in 1492. So then when you look at 1500, when Roger Davis's start date for the period that he's covering in his book, it's very likely that a lot of these raiders might have viewed Spain as their native country. Like there probably were a lot of Berbers, African, Arab men who were born in Spain who'd been displaced, and they viewed, raiding back against, maybe their own old village and capturing white Christians as just, they took my home, I'm taking them,
Yeah, like we were saying earlier, like I was telling you earlier, this time period, it's just a free-for-all. Everyone was enslaving everyone, it was just a terrible time to be alive. It was literally survival of the fittest.
Anyways, let's get into some of the slides here, because one of the things that you touched on, we'll actually talk about a little further on in terms of populations moving away from the coast and why that may have happened.
Okay.
So I want to
start having some
off
technical difficulties here, so I'm not sure what's going on. But we'll keep it going. I'll try to work it out.
One of the things that I want all of you listeners to understand is, even in the Marines hymn, because even though this is something that we don't talk about with white slavery by African sailors or pirates, we do come across the lyrics that oftentimes we don't understand where they're from. But in the Marines hymn, it says, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fight our nation's battles in the air, on the land, and sea. First to fight for right and freedom, and to keep our honor clean. We are proud to claim the title of United States Marine." But going back to the second line here, "to the shores of Tripoli," this is because one of the first engagements of the new United States in the 1790s was to battle against the Barbary Coast pirates, because they were such a significant threat to Southern Europeans as well as Americans who were frustrated with American sailors being captured and either forced into piracy with the Barbary Coast pirates or slavery, that the new American Republic sent over the Navy to get rid of the pirates. So that's why we have that stanza, or not the stanza, but that line, "to the shores of Tripoli," meaning the Marines went all the way down to Mexico City and they went all the way across the ocean to Africa to fight. And that was actually the United States' first overseas battle, was against the Barbary Coast pirates. Okay. So
interesting.
There is
Give
evidence of
context.
what we're talking about, even though it's not well known today.
Okay.
Okay, so over here we have a picture on the left of Robert Davis, and then I have another book written by Brian Kilmeade, and this is just to show that there is research that's been done on this topic. This is about the Tripoli pirates and the forgotten war that changed American history. Brian Kilmeade is a pretty well known.
Is he a journalist?
No, he's a history, author,
Gotcha.
and it's a very good book. But anyways, let's continue on. In this, Roger Davis is basically saying that a new study suggests that 1 million or more European Christians were enslaved by Muslims in North Africa between 1530 and 1780, a far greater number than had ever been estimated before. And what's unique about Roger Davis's addition to this field is where he's actually come up with a methodology where you could calculate roughly the number of people who might have been captured or enslaved by the Barbary Coast pirates. And
Okay.
in the past, we'd believe that maybe it had just been a couple thousand slaves. But what his numbers are showing up as is that in order for you to maintain the slave population that they had of white or Christian Europeans in Africa, you would have had to have a slave trade that was about 1 to 1.25 million European Christians who were captured over roughly 250 to 300 year period. I mean, that's a staggering number. Of course, that's still about 1/10 of the population of African slaves that were taken to the New World. But
Right.
again, 1 to 1.25 million people is also nothing to scoff at.
Now that you bring in, statistics in terms of population, Africa had way more people in comparison to Europe, and especially after they lost huge numbers when it came to the plague.
Yeah.
They lost large swaths of their population. So 1/10 is significant. That 10th, even compared to Africa, is very significant, considering they didn't have the same type of population.
And like when you're looking at this, there's a lot more inviting places to live in Africa than in northern places in Europe and some of the other places, because Africa is actually a very naturally resource-rich continent.
Right.
Okay, so it says much of what has been written gives the impression that there were not many slaves and minimizes the impact that slavery had on Europe, Davis said. Most accounts only took slavery in one place, or only for a short period of time. But when you take a broader, longer view, the massive scope of this slavery and its powerful impact become clearer. Davis said it's useful to compare this Mediterranean slavery to the Atlantic slave trade that brought Black Africans to the Americas. Over the course of 4 centuries, the African slave trade was much larger. About 10 to 12 million Black Africans were brought to the Americas. But from 1500 to 1650, when the transatlantic slaving was still in its infancy, more white Christians were probably taken to the Barbary than Black African slaves to the Americas, according to Davis. So that's a really important thing. If you take, for that 150-year period between 1500 and 1650,
Right.
more white people were sent to Africa as slaves than Black people going to the New World as slaves.
Now let me interject something here. I want to give the audience, our viewers, something to think about. Here's a question. For those of you who are just finding out about European slavery at the hands of these Africans in the north of Africa on the Barbary Coast, what was, especially for those of you who were born and raised in the United States, who've been educated the same way we've been educated, we're both American. What was your impression of, how do you view white people now in terms of, the power structure in the country and in the world versus now learning about how they routinely fell victim for hundreds of years? How many? 300 years? How they routinely fell victim to non-Europeans who seem to at will take men, women, and children. How does that change your perception of Europeans, and especially at this time period? Anyway, that's just a question. Now I'll ask you the same question, Seiji. What does that do? What does that sort of indicate to you? Like, how does that make you, and I have an answer and I'll answer too, but what does that make you think of?
What it indicate? Well, there's two things I want to say. Number one, this is only talking about Southern Europeans and kind of Western Europeans that are getting captured by the Barbary Coast pirates. We're not even talking about Slavic Europeans who are, different ethnic group of white, but they're also being captured by Turks and other people and sold into slavery, even by their own people.
Right.
One of the things that also comes out from this is that when we look at the plight and the problem of slavery, we have to recognize that slavery was only in the last 500 years or less basically viewed racially, where one race was capturing another race. So you look and say, oh, black people means slave or inferior. That was not something that would have been understood 500 or 1,000 years ago, because it seems like people a long time ago had a better view of race than we do today.
A more accurate view, because they actually lived through some of these events. And it seems, correct. And as Davis points out, it seems like the history has kind of been muted, and intentionally, it has to be intentional, because history is history. But if you intentionally leave something out, then it becomes propaganda.
And again, one of the reasons that we're highlighting this topic is because we want people to see that slavery is not just one thing that one race perpetrated singularly on another race. Slavery is something that has happened throughout history, because whenever there has been profit to be made by selling narcotics or weapons or humans, people have taken advantage of that, regardless of their race, regardless of their culture.
Right.
We as humans, as you get past the epidermis, we're exactly the same. The way our motivations are the same.
And epidermis,
our desires, everything is the same.
The skin, for people who don't know what that is, the top layer of the skin. Epidermis.
So, continuing on, one of the things that both public and many scholars have tended to take as given is that slavery was always racial in nature, that only blacks have been slaves. But that is not the case, Davis said. We cannot think of slavery as something that only white people did to black people.
Right.
During the time period Davis studied, it was religion and ethnicity as much as race that determined who became slaves.
Right. Yeah. Totally different from how it's sort of presented today, or how it's kind of left out there for us to interpret it. I think that there's a huge difference in what's going on. And guys, I want to apologize for the technical difficulties I'm having. I don't know why, but this Elgato cam link, you guys, you'll see it pop up on the screen every once in a while.
So don't buy an Elgato. Don't buy
I don't know what's going on with this thing. This thing cost me $90, and it's literally like I haven't even had it a full 3 months, and it's already acting out. Anyway, I'm glad that Davis is being intellectually honest, and he's not looking at this through the lens of power, right? Because I feel like a lot of people sort of mute information due to power, due to maintain a perception. Let me give you a good example. There goes the Elgato again. Let me give you a good example. The Japanese don't talk about their actions over in certain parts of Asia. You know, when they were imperial Japan, when they were imperialist, they sort of leave those details out. At the Beijing Olympics, when Japan was playing China, the Japanese soccer players couldn't understand why the Chinese crowd was booing. They didn't understand what was going on because from what I learned in the Japanese system, they didn't teach their students about the evils that they did during the imperialistic period. So they were totally unaware of why the Chinese didn't like them. So that's a, you know, but in the West would brag about something like that. You know, they would brag about it, put it in books because it's a trophy for them. But with the Japanese, they saw it as shameful, and they moved away
it's shameful because they lost. That's unfortunately the thing. So
well, in the end,
for the European perspective or the American perspective, you know, white culture has been the dominant one and was victorious. So then the victor writes the history or record.
Writes the history book. Yeah, imagine writing, if you're let's say a basketball team, and putting that you never lost. You know what I mean? Just kind of putting, here's all our victories and zero.
It's like the Lakers. Now we have losses. A series. Yeah, we have a series called the Winning Time. I grew up near Washington, D.C. You don't have anything on the Washington Bullets because they were bad every year. You know, they were horrible. But anyways, it says enslavement was a very real possibility for anyone who traveled in the Mediterranean, who lived along the shores in places like Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal, and even as far north as England and Iceland. So imagine this. What he's saying is, if you were a traveler in these places, you had to be very careful because it was a real possibility that you might get captured and sold as a slave.
Yeah.
It was also a very real possibility that your village might get raided. So the easiest way to avoid being quickly captured was for everyone to move away from the coast.
Isn't that something? That's amazing. I just find that incredible. And let's look at it. You know, we kind of briefly mentioned the Slavs. Let's look at it from another aspect. We're talking about Italy, someone who invaded. Italy, you know, surprisingly wasn't very good at being at colonialization. Even with proximity to Africa, they don't have any. No one speaks Italian in Africa except for Eritrea. There are people there that speak Italian, but it's such a tiny country. But they don't have any, like, you know, compared to the rest of Europe, like, and then just considering the power structure right now is Western European. Look at how they were running for their lives when these Barbary pirates were roaming the seas for 300 years. Maybe it strengthened them. Maybe it made them who they are today. Maybe it got them, you know, necessitated stronger navies and stronger defense. Anyway, go.
See, the thing is, Italy itself was not a unified country until 1866. For much of most of Italy's last 500 years, or maybe 600 years, they were dominated by France, Spain, and Austria, or the Habsburg Empire. And even if you look at the modern map of Italy, it's very different than it would have looked like in 1866 even.
All right. I just want to say welcome to anyone that's in the chat, any of our viewers. Welcome to the Safety Bar podcast. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go ahead and continue. So,
okay. Pirates called corsairs from cities along the Barbary Coast in North Africa, cities such as Tunis and Algiers would raid ships in the Mediterranean and Atlantic as well as seaside villages to capture men, women, and children. The impact of these attacks were devastating. France, England, and Spain each lost thousands of ships, and long stretches of the Spanish and Italian coasts were almost completely abandoned by their inhabitants. At its peak, the destruction and depopulation of some areas probably exceeded what European slavers would later inflict on the African interior.
Hey, Brett, how's it going? Thanks for joining us. Yeah, I mean, this is this is kind of, you know, it's hard to believe that all this happened, but it shows you that what it shows me is that anyone can be a victim. Doesn't matter how smart you are. Doesn't matter anything. If you're not prepared for people who are coming for you, you can be a victim too.
Yeah, and well, I just want you to think about this. A lot of people, if you live near the coast, you can find food pretty easily or readily by going fishing. But what we're talking about is the southern coast of France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, that are completely uninhabited because people were scared of being captured by these pirates. It's amazing when you take out that food from from the economy, how many other people couldn't have been fed, and the population of Europe would also have then correspondingly been reduced by the lack of food supplies. So you wouldn't have as many kids if you couldn't feed your family. More people would have died. And that was because people were too scared to go to the coast and go fishing. You couldn't live near the coast.
Yeah. So there's a time where, you know, and interestingly enough, let me put this out there. During the height of, you know, the African slave trade, when Africans were going and rounding up other Africans in the interior. See, the Barbary pirates were just doing the coastline, and the people moved to the interior. With the African slave trade, the Europeans stayed. They couldn't go further in. The African leaders wouldn't let them go in, and plus it was very dangerous, some historians say, for them to go in. So African tribes would go and kidnap people, but these people would be doing daily things like getting water, and then they would disappear, and they'd show up in some, you know, on some slave ship after that. So likewise, you know, if the Barbary pirates had decided to take their piracy to another level, they could have, you know, possibly gone into the interior, but then that would have meant war with the people who were there in the interior, and we don't know how that would have worked out. But one of the questions that comes to mind is just a second. One of the questions that comes to mind is why didn't more people come to the coastline and strengthen their military on the coastline, strengthen their defenses? That's something that interests me. Did they not have the unity that's necessary? I mean,
they didn't have I'll tell you, they didn't have enough people, because the European coastline, when you look at the coast of Portugal through Italy itself it's all coastline. A pirate could virtually invade anywhere they wanted in Italy except for the mountains.
Gotcha.
So then the other thing to look at is when you're looking at slavery, from what the Barbary coast pirates were doing was capturing people on the coast. You brought up a very interesting point where you have Africans who are selling other Africans from the interior to European buyers on the coast.
Right.
Now, we don't, at least as far as I know, and I need to look into this, do we have examples of Europeans capturing, let's say, a German capturing a Frenchman and selling them to Barbary Coast pirates?
Not that I've read. I haven't done deep research into this, but I'm also, while we're talking about European slavery, I'm also very fascinated by Slavs. I know the Arabs were taking the Slavic people at will, and with the Arabs, there's great unity and and a heart for warfare. They don't seem to shy away from that. And I'm not sure how much of that is religious conquest in terms of Islam.
It's actually interesting that you bring that up, because if you look at Slav, Slav, we
Right.
get the name slave from Slavic, Slavs. So it's not skin color or race has never been associated with slavery until the last 500 years.
Right. The last group of people to be slaves, I guess it makes sense.
Yes.
What's interesting is that this information changes my perspective. For instance, when I look at a Slav now, when I see a Slavic person on television, I still see them as a human being, but I see them as not being able to, I also see them as victims. I'm like, whoa, you aren't, we get the word slave from you guys, from your ethnic group. That's insane. And I see them differently than what in the past. I would view them as different from Western Europeans. I would view Western Europeans as being more powerful. But now that I'm learning about the Barbary pirates and the 5-finger discount they were getting on coastal Europeans, it's unfortunate for those people. Anyone who gets caught up in slavery, it's sad. It's still happening. I see anyone, and it's important that Europeans understand this. Anyone can become a slave. Anyone can be overpowered by any race and taken, as long as they have infrastructure to do so. And the Barbary pirates had the Corsairs, from what I understand, were pretty fast ships, fast boats, fast ships. So,
and these were terrifying pirates. I mean, they were opportunists of the first order,
Yeah, it seems like they did it full time.
Yeah.
That's what it seems like. It seems like it was a full-time job for these guys.
Continuing on, Davis said that the vast scope of slavery in North Africa has been ignored and minimized in large part because it is on no one's agenda to discuss what happened.
Ooh,
the enslavement of Europeans doesn't fit the general theme of European world conquest and colonialism that is central to scholarship on the early modern era, he said. Many of the countries that were victims of slavery, such as France and Spain, would later conquer and colonize the areas of North Africa where their citizens were once held as slaves.
Right.
Maybe because of this history, Western scholars have thought of the Europeans primarily as evil colonialists and not as the victims they sometimes were, Davis said. So I want you to think about this. Thomas Jefferson sent the Marines in to attack the Barbary Coast pirates in Tripoli.
Right.
Eventually, the Spanish and the French, when they had a strong enough countries, they invaded across the Mediterranean and captured these ports and eventually set up colonies in North Africa where basically, one could argue it was to prevent their citizens from being captured anymore. It was in their national interest to end that piracy trade or those pirates forever. And one way of doing that was by capturing their ports and basically taking over their country.
Makes sense. It definitely makes sense. There is an incentive. Like I said, so here it's like they're going on the offensive.
Yeah.
They're preemptive striking, which makes sense. You have to stop what's happening. It's like it's very different to what was happening with Africans. Africans were all on board when it came to slavery. They were like, hey, show us the money. We don't like these groups anyway. And one of the things, let me point this out, Africa's got the most languages in the world. And in just one of these West African countries, you can have 50 languages easily. So different languages creates different cultures and creates different enemy groups. So Africa was not only opportune in terms of location, proximity to Europe, but also the language groups provided an easy source to pick off, and to get people in the vicinity to actually help facilitate slavery. And this is what they did. Whereas in Europe, whenever you're in a country that has one language or very few languages as opposed to 50, so let's say like somewhere in Ghana or Nigeria, you have more unity. And when you have unity, you can do things like mount an offensive, a preemptive strike against the Barbary Coast to stop what had been going on for 300 years.
And the other thing is, when Africans were selling other Africans, like Bard was saying, it was one tribe selling their enemies, another tribe, into slavery. So it wasn't a problem for them. To the European opportunists who were buying these people, it was just a black guy who was being sold as a slave. That was it.
That was it. And the Europeans would, they had their favorite slaves. I guess some of their a favorite group of people started to stand out amongst the group, and that was the Igbo people. Mm-hmm. IGBO. And as a result of them being stronger than the rest of the people in that part of Africa, they became a favorite. And now as a result, Igbo blood is spread all over South America, Central America, and all over the Americas. Igbo blood. I've got Igbo blood. And so that's a result of what happened. Now, contrast that with somewhere like Italy. I don't know how many different groups are in Italy, but I can guarantee you they didn't have more than two or three languages at that time. I know Germany had a couple of languages. There were a couple of Germanic tribes, but not many. It wasn't to an extent where you could take advantage of the language and the cultural barriers, happening like what was happening in Africa. There wasn't that same level of opportunity that could be capitalized on by. And once again, guys, sorry for the technical difficulties. You guys can hear me, but having some difficulties with the camera. We'll have it worked out for the next stream. But so I think language plays a major part in producing tons of has a splintering effect across the country, and as a result of that splintering effect, it made it a prime target for invasion and for capitalist venturing when it comes to slavery, which we now see. Anyway, let's try to move through these slides pretty quickly. We've got another 20 minutes we're going to do on this live stream.
Okay. So Davis said another reason that Mediterranean slavery has been ignored or minimized has been that there have not been any good estimates on the total number of people enslaved. People at the time, both Europeans and Barbary Coast slave owners, did not keep detailed, trustworthy records of the number of slaves. In contrast, there are extensive records that document the number of Africans brought to the Americas as slaves. So, one way I would look at this is it's similar. The Germans kept really good records of the people they were killing in their concentration camps and death camps, whereas the Russians and Chinese did not keep good records. When we look at what's going on here, why is it that you have better records for Europeans keeping records of Africans being transported to either South America, the Caribbean, or North America? I would speculate that it would be because it costs a lot more to transport them further along.
Definitely.
Whereas directly raiding across the Mediterranean was relatively a simple task compared to the amount of food and planning that would go into an over the ocean voyage.
Yeah, transatlantic voyage. Yeah, I agree with you. It was much more of a intricate mission. You know, takes a lot of planning. We're talking about 3 months at sea versus whatever time frame you have operating within that small channel where the Barbary pirates were operating.
And see, if you're a raiding pirate on the Spanish coast, you could foreseeably pick a bunch of people up, maybe 50 people in a day, and then sail back and be home the next day at a market in Marrakesh or, somewhere selling them. Whereas in like sub-Saharan Africa, you would have to have one tribe capture other people, bring them to the coast, have a significant enough number of them for you to then purchase and load onto a ship. So you had to have a buyer, or like who would buy them from the African tribe that would bring them to the coast. You had to hold them for a period of time until another captain showed up to purchase the cargo from, or the people from the coast, and then transport them. Then you had to transport them across to another buyer who would then put them on a slave auction block.
Yeah, it's much more detailed. There's much more business involved. You know, the logistics were, pretty. The logistics were pretty.
Yeah.
What's the word I'm looking for? I mean, even for back then, pretty tough. I mean, a lot of moving parts, a lot going on. You know, and they were very selective. They became very selective with their slaves, like I was mentioning before. So it made it even more. So their not marketing, but their channel of their business channel. There's a word I'm looking for. Their channel was very, very detailed. Then they had to talk to the Africans and trade things. So they had to transport guns, alcohol, fabric, different things that the African tribal, the different tribes.
Basically, not a vertically integrated system. You had to deal with other people all along. I mean, you had to make sure you had food, water, all of the other stuff that was going on, so that you could be profitable.
Exactly. It was. That's why they had to document it, because I know there was a certain amount of deaths as well on the African side. With the Barbary pirates, I mean, it wasn't as the proximity made it so much easier to grab people and just put them in chains and then transport them back in a day or two, and they're there. They probably wouldn't even have to feed them, to be honest. Maybe give them a little bit of water, and that's it. So much easier trade. Anyway, let's move on. If you're ready.
So it says, so Davis developed a new methodology to come up with the reasonable estimates of the number of slaves along the Barbary coast. Davis found the best records available indicating how many slaves were at a particular location at a single time. He then estimated how many new slaves it would take to replace slaves as they died, escaped, or were ransomed. So to give you an idea of the difference with Davis's research is that he's looking at numbers of how many slaves were in a particular area at a specific point in time, and then trying to make an estimate based on how many slaves it would take to replace that slave population. And that's how he eventually came up with his numbers. So again, there might be other places that we don't know about that had more slaves, and there might have been more slaves that were taken, but it's highly unlikely that there were less slaves.
That is a good question. Why don't we have as good of records? What were they doing with these slaves? That right there, it tells me it might not necessarily have been so much about capitalism, about selling these people. Do you have any information on that? It might have just been for simple trade for things that they wanted or needed, because these guys were doing this full time. But it wasn't we know it wasn't as intricate as the African slave trade. Like there wasn't built infrastructure to house slaves. They would just go grab them. They didn't have, like, for instance, in Senegal and Ghana, they have these edifices where they actually housed slaves for months, prior to their transatlantic voyage. And they even had little prisons, I found out just recently, where they would put the rebellious slaves who dared to want their freedom, who dared to want to go back home to their family, to their families.
And the thing is, if you have more people living in a town, a random group of pirates, it would take a couple of groups of pirates for you to go capture people. I mean, it's like looking at the Somali pirates today. If they're going to ride up in their little inflatable raft dingies up to an ocean liner, you're probably going to pull out a gun and start shooting at them, and it's going to be hard for them to fight back because it's a big ship against a tiny group of Somali pirates. So then
speedboat or something.
I'm guessing that they didn't try attacking Barcelona because that was a huge city on the coast.
Mm-hmm.
But you could find other random villages, and that's why people also group together.
What's interesting? What's interesting is when you look at the DNA results for a lot of people, this is so fascinating. When you look at the DNA results for a lot of people, let's just say people of Latin American descent over here, south of California, let's say Mexican, and a lot of Latin America, a lot of these people have North African blood. And it almost makes you wonder how they got so much North African blood. And could it be that it's from some of this slave trade?
It very well could be. So
Davis
talked about his methodology. The only way I could come up with hard numbers is to turn the whole problem upside down. Figure out how many slaves they would have to capture to maintain a certain level, he said. It is not the best way to make population estimates, but it is the only way with limited records available. Davis calculated that about 1/4 of the slaves had to be replaced each year to keep the slave population stable, as it apparently was between 1580 and 1680. That meant about 8,500 new slaves had to be captured each year. Overall, this suggests nearly 1 million slaves would have been captive during the period. Using the same methodology, Davis has estimated as many as 475,000 additional slaves were taken in the previous and following centuries. Okay? So the result is that between 1530 and 1780, there were certainly 1 million and quite possibly as many as 1.25 million white European Christians enslaved by the Muslims of the Barbary Coast. Davis said his research into the treatment of these slaves suggests that for most of them, their lives were every bit as difficult as that of slaves in America. As far as daily living conditions, the Mediterranean slaves certainly didn't have it better, he said. So this is really interesting. When you look at the everyday record of those slaves and their lives in Africa, they did not have a wonderful life. Their lives were every bit as miserable as a field slave working on a sugarcane or cotton or tobacco plantation in the New World.
What were they doing with these slaves? Do we have that data? We know they're being captured, obviously, but what were they doing with them? That's the question. Do we have any data on that? I'm going to actually kind of look that up live as you talk because I'm curious.
It says, he continues on to say, while African slaves did grueling labor on sugar and cotton plantations in the Americas, European Christian slaves were often worked just as hard and as lethally in quarries, heavy construction, and above all, rowing the corsair galleys So basically, Bard,
They were
it
engines.
seems like a lot of them were galley slaves, like in Ben Hur, you know,
Wow.
where
So they used them. Well, it makes sense using them for labor, but
row
so
well and live.
so they were working in quarries.
Yeah.
So they had them. Wow. Okay.
And that could have also been because, well, I guess that was past the time they were building, castle walls, but they were maybe building, engaged in building structures, or you're using galley slaves was the most terrifying because you were chained to your oars.
Right. I'm reading something here from Clements. It looks like University of Michigan.edu says Barbary slaves suffered heavy labor, poor diets, and demeaning circumstances, much like their African counterparts in the United States. However, white captives could also often escape slavery by converting to Islam. So this is definitely a religious thing. The Islamic nations would give so-called infidels an option out of their circumstance. This is typical of Islam. I believe it says it in the Quran. I believe I read it in the Quran. And they would adopt North Africa as their home. So there was a way out for them, and it was through Islam. But they would have to settle there, which is interesting. Which is why so a lot of those white people who are probably in North Africa, or the white genes that are there, they're most likely their ancestry is slaves, that of slaves. Do we have a date on when this ended?
Well, it didn't end until the Barbary Coast pirates were defeated, and that was in the early 1800s.
Okay.
I think they might have been raiding all the way up until about the 1830s, which was about the same time. I think the African slave trade was banned in the British Empire in 1832, even though it continued in different forms as servants and everything else for a lot longer. But let's continue on. It says, we have lost the sense of how large enslavement could loom for those who lived around the Mediterranean and the threat they were under, he said. Slaves were still slaves, whether they were black or white, and whether they suffered in America or North Africa.
Right.
And I think that's a really good note to basically end on. That slavery is something that almost every race of people have had to experience, even if that slavery came at the hands of your own people. Like, right. Before these African slaves were sold to the Europeans, they might have been slaves of another African tribe. And one way of getting rid of your enemies so they don't reproduce again is by just selling them off to the white people so you would never see them again.
Hey, and it ends the war.
Well, you look at it even into this last century, not even 100 years ago, Hitler attempted to do the same thing with a lot of people. They were still, by Bard and my standards, we would look at them and say they're white. Well, Hitler was trying to get rid of other white people because they weren't the right type of Anglo-Saxon Protestant white people, or whatever. They weren't Germanic white people that he wanted. And he's like, okay, well, let's just shoot them wholesale, kill them, gas them. And so this is not something that only black people did to black people. White people have done that for even longer. I mean, all the way up until not even 100 years ago.
Right, and right.
We are all people. We make the same mistakes.
Definitely, we definitely do. Maybe what we can do is kind of analyze the Slavic slave trade and what the Arabs did with them as well in another episode.
Yeah.
I don't really have anything else to add to this. I think this has been a great episode. Guys, leave us your comments. Definitely comment on this. Let us know what you think. How does this change your perspective of, Europeans who seem to be invincible, or who've created this imagery of being invincible by eliminating this from their history after they eventually won. Do you have any comments on that, by the way? How did this change your perspective once you learned about European slavery?
It doesn't change my perspective too much, because in other countries you've had Europeans who sold Europeans as slaves. I mean, they sold Chinese have had Chinese slaves. Indians have had Indian slaves. It's not something that's unique. Slavery is not an experience that was unique to Black people, and I think that we make a big mistake in the United States to allow people to believe that in any way, shape, or form. It's wrong.
Right. It's propaganda. And we know even Davis, the author, knows why it's being done. He pointed to, some factors. The winners don't have to talk about their losses. That's true. They get to write history. They get the benefits. And if you're going to write history, why would you put that in, And it serves the purpose of creating this image of, oh, we're invincible. It's kind of like, some other things we'll probably get into later on when it comes to how religion was used. Maybe we'll talk about some of that when we've decided to do a little discussion on the slave Bible used here in the United States. Yes. We'll probably do some research and look into that and have a discussion on that. All right, Seiji, are we ready to wrap up, or anything else you want to talk about?
No, but we would love to hear your comments. If any of you guys have any questions, we're happy to look into it for you. We would love to hear any feedback on this really interesting topic. And just remember, we're all human. We've all made mistakes. Our history is our history. We can't change that. Mm-hmm. When you dig down past our skin, we're all the same inside.
That is the truth. There it is. All right. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Guys, thank you for joining us on this special live stream. And you'll see this as a video. Please be sure to like. Helps out the algorithm. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers. Help us get to our goal. It's a great goal. We have a lot more coming. And definitely comment. Leave us your comments. Let us know what you think. Answer some of those questions. How did this change your perspective of Europe and what was happening? And we will definitely see you in the next one, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.